Welcome to the Tales of Deception YouTube channel. This is where we share emotional stories that reveal the hidden sides of family and social relationships, helping us gain a deeper and more diverse perspective on life. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the intriguing and surprising stories we bring to you every day. Today, I want to share with you a story about a mother facing difficult choices, where emotions and family responsibilities collide. This story will make you reflect on the cracks in relationships and how we deal with the consequences of our decisions. Let's get started.
It's strange how one moment can change the entire course of your life. Sometimes, you think you know yourself, you think you have everything under control, but then, something unexpected happens. And the world shifts beneath you. That's what happened to me on that day, a day that still haunts me, 2 years later. My name is Nora, and like many women, I've spent years trying to balance everything: work, family, responsibilities. But even when you try your best, things don't always turn out the way you hope. My husband, David, was always there physically, but emotionally, he was miles away. His job consumed him, and I was left to handle everything else. The kids, Benjamin, my son, and Grace, my daughter, they kept me busy. But in a different way. We had a home, we had a family, but we didn't really have a connection. I hadn't felt truly seen in years. And then, there was that day. David was working late again, as usual, and I was supposed to take the kids on a beach trip. Benjamin, my teenage son, was excited, but not for the reasons you might think. As a mother, you always try to see the best in your children, but even then, sometimes you miss the signs. Benjamin wasn't the same boy I had raised. He had grown up, and not just physically. He was more distant. More quiet, as though he was carrying something I couldn't see. We arrived at the beach, the sun beating down on us. It felt like a perfect day, but deep inside, I felt the weight of my loneliness pressing against me. I spread out the towels and lay down on the sand, trying to ignore the feeling that had started to grow inside me. The feeling of something missing, something that I desperately needed. I turned to Benjamin and asked, "Can you help me with some sunscreen on my back? I can't reach it myself." It was a simple request, innocent even, but in that moment, everything changed. When his hands touched me, everything seemed to pause. That moment, though only lasting a second, had such a powerful effect that I couldn't explain it. Suddenly, I forgot everything around me, the beach, the space, it all disappeared. There was only the gentle touch of his hands. It was the feeling of care, the feeling of being needed and loved, even if just for a moment. A feeling I hadn't experienced in so long. A feeling I had buried deep inside. Convincing myself that I didn't need it, that I wasn't worthy. But in that instant, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. At first, his touch was soft, gentle, like when he was a little boy, holding my hand to cross the street. I smiled to myself, remembering those little moments I loved so much. But then, as his hands grew firmer, I felt a jolt of electricity run through me. It wasn't about sunscreen anymore. It wasn't about helping his mother anymore. Something had shifted, between us, in that space, in that moment. I told myself it was fine. That my son was just helping out, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. His hands were no longer innocent, no longer just comforting. He was stopping in places where he shouldn't. I could feel my breath quicken, and for a moment, I wanted to pull his hands away. But instead, I told him to continue. I didn't stop myself. Part of me wanted to stop. Wanted to hold on to what I thought was right. But another part of me wanted to feel more, to continue, to let this sensation linger longer. It was as if a part of me had stopped fighting and just wanted to be loved, to be cared for, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't motherly love anymore. It wasn't the unconditional care of a parent. It was something blurred, something I wasn't ready to admit. I felt a strange sadness, but I couldn't resist. His hands weren't the same anymore. They weren't just for comforting. They had become something else, exploratory, a touch that moved into areas I had kept hidden for so long. I wanted to pull away, but I couldn't. Because the desire to feel wanted, to feel noticed, was overpowering. In that moment, I knew I had crossed a line. I asked myself if I could ever go back. Could I stop now and pick up where we left off? But deep down, I realized I had grown too tired of being invisible. For so many years, I had been forgotten, left behind. And now, in this instant, I didn't want to stop. That moment changed everything. As soon as we got home that evening, everything between Benjamin and me felt different. At first, it wasn't easy to spot, but I felt it. His gaze had shifted. The way he looked at me was no longer the way a son looks at his mother. There was something in his eyes that wasn't there before. He was close, but there was a certain distance now. A quietness that spoke louder than any words ever could. Silence filled the space between us like an unbearable weight. I started to question myself. Why hadn't I stopped him? Why hadn't I just gotten up and walked away? The answer, however, wasn't as simple as I wanted it to be. The truth was, I was lonely. For so many years, I had become invisible in the eyes of my husband, David. His job always came first, and I was left to navigate life alone. When he came home, he barely acknowledged my presence. His mind was elsewhere, focused on work, while I was left in the background, forgotten, like an old photograph gathering dust. I had convinced myself for so long that it was okay. I convinced myself that his devotion to work was for us, for the family. But as the years went by, I started to wonder, what was the point of a house, a family, if no one was ever really there? It's hard to keep telling yourself a lie when you've lived in it for too long. I was starving for attention, for care, for love. And in some twisted way, Benjamin became the one to offer that. His touch, his attention, though wrong, was the only thing that made me feel seen. The guilt hit me like a wave crashing onto the shore. It was crushing, suffocating, and yet. Each time I looked into Benjamin's eyes, I felt something stir inside me, something that I had buried so deep within myself for so long. It was like a part of me that I had forgotten existed was waking up again, and I didn't know whether to welcome it or run from it. Every time I caught his gaze, it felt like a silent confession. A mutual understanding of the unspeakable thing that had passed between us. It was as though the air around us had changed, becoming thicker, heavier, with the unspoken truth. The pull between us was undeniable. Every glance, every brief touch, felt like a spark, a reminder of that moment at the beach. I hated myself for it. I hated myself for not stopping it. For letting it go on. But there was another part of me, a part one couldn't ignore, that felt alive for the first time in years. I didn't know how to deal with what had happened. I couldn't talk to David about it. There was no way to explain this, not to him, not to anyone. And yet, I didn't know how to stop the feelings that had started to grow. Feelings that I didn't know I was capable of anymore. It was as if the need for closeness, the need to be wanted, had consumed me. And in some twisted way, Benjamin's presence in my life had filled that void, even if it was wrong, even if it was something I could never take back. The days passed in a blur. Benjamin acted as though nothing had changed. And yet, I could see it in the way he looked at me, the way he lingered a little too long when he spoke. The silence between us grew, and it was the loudest thing I had ever felt. It wasn't just the tension between us, it was the realization that I had crossed a line. There was no going back. No matter how much I told myself it was a mistake. That it was just a moment of weakness, deep down, I knew better. I had allowed it to happen, and I wasn't sure if I even wanted to stop. Every night, I lay in bed next to David. And I could feel the weight of what had happened pressing on my chest. I could hear the rhythm of his breathing, slow and steady, while my mind raced with the events of the day. I kept thinking about Benjamin, about his hands, about the way he looked at me. And when I closed my eyes, I could still feel the lingering warmth of his touch on my skin. Like a ghost that wouldn't leave. I wanted to stop. I wanted to erase what had happened, to pretend that it was just a fleeting mistake. But every time I tried, I was drawn back to that moment. The guilt, the shame, the undeniable connection, it was all too much to bear. And yet, it was all I could think about. A few days later, we returned to the beach. David was once again working. And it was just Benjamin and me. The tension between us was palpable, thicker than the salty air around us, yet neither of us spoke of it. We didn't need to. It was there, between us. Unspoken and undeniable. The unspoken words hung heavily in the space, lingering with a weight neither of us could shake off. It was a silence that felt louder than any conversation we might have had. We both knew what had happened before, and neither of us could forget it. I felt it as soon as we arrived. The usual excitement of the beach day wasn't there. I was still trying to push away the memories of what had transpired between us. The thought kept creeping into my mind, reminding me of how everything had shifted after that moment. But I wasn't ready to confront it yet, at least not openly. It was like I was trapped in a quiet war within myself. Caught between wanting to bury what happened and feeling the undeniable pull that I couldn't ignore. We set up our towels like we always did, but everything was different now. Each glance I caught from Benjamin made my stomach twist. It wasn't the casual look of a son. It wasn't the playful glance of a teenager who didn't want to be there. It was something else. A look I couldn't place, but it was there, always following me, making me aware of him in a way I never had before. I kept my distance from him, or at least I tried to. My mind raced. Trying to focus on something, anything, to distract me from the heavy awareness between us. We spent the day in silence, the waves crashing in the distance. But their sound felt muffled compared to the beating of my heart. I could hear the way he moved, the way his footsteps sounded beside me, and I knew he felt it too, the tension. The unspoken connection that lingered like a shadow between us. As the day came to an end, we packed up and walked toward the showers to rinse off the sand. The air had grown warmer. And the sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the water. I wanted to feel normal again, to let go of the strange weight in my chest, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about the touch, the way his hands had felt on my skin. It wasn't just a memory anymore, it was a constant, pulsing presence in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his breath, felt the heat of his hands. When we reached the showers, I hesitated. The cool water was inviting. But my thoughts were anything but calm. Benjamin went first, letting the water wash over him as I stood by, watching, trying not to notice how his body had changed. How different he was now compared to the child I once knew. He was taller, more defined, and I couldn't help but feel a strange flutter in my chest, something unfamiliar, something I knew was wrong. I turned away for a moment, trying to steady my thoughts, but when I turned back, I saw Benjamin looking at me. He wasn't just looking, he was staring. With a quiet intensity that made my heart skip a beat. My breath caught in my throat as I felt his eyes on me, as if he could see through me, see everything I was trying to hide. I didn't know how long we stood there in that silence, but it felt like an eternity. The air was thick with something unspoken, and I could feel myself drawn to him in a way I hadn't been before. Without thinking, I spoke. My voice was quiet, almost a whisper, and yet it felt loud against the silence that surrounded us. "Benjamin, can you help me rinse my back?" The words left my mouth before I could stop them. I hadn't meant to ask him for this, but somehow, I couldn't pull back now. I could feel the tension rising between us, thickening the air. And I knew deep down, that once I said those words, things wouldn't be the same again. Benjamin didn't say anything. He just nodded, and for a moment, I wondered if he would refuse. But he didn't. He stepped closer, slowly, cautiously, as if unsure, but compelled to do what I had asked. I could feel the heat radiating off him as he moved behind me, his presence overwhelming, filling the space between us. I stood still, unable to move, as his hands reached for the soap and began to lather it on my back. The water was cold, but his touch was anything but. As his hands moved over my skin, I felt an electric current shoot through me, a shiver running down my spine. His touch was slow, deliberate, and it made my breath catch in my throat. I didn't know what I was feeling, only that it was a combination of desire and something far more complicated, something I couldn't explain. I felt his fingers glide down my back, and in that moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought to control my breath. I could feel his hands linger longer than necessary. He was tracing the curve of my body with a hesitation that matched my own. I knew, in that instant, that something had shifted permanently between us. The line we had crossed before was no longer invisible, it had become a permanent fixture in our relationship. But despite the shame, the guilt, I didn't stop him. I didn't pull away. For a long moment, we stood there under the cold shower, the water cascading down over us, and I felt a strange warmth grow between us. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't need to. It was like we were both caught in a moment where nothing else mattered, where the world around us ceased to exist, and there was only this, the heat of his hands, the weight of the silence. The pressure of the unspoken connection that hung between us. I didn't stop him. From that moment, everything began to spiral out of control. The boundaries between us became blurred, fading away as if they had never existed. What had begun as a simple gesture between a mother and her son had now become something unrecognizable, something neither of us could control. I found myself questioning everything, caught in a storm of emotions that seemed to overwhelm me, each wave pushing me further from where I once was. How did I get here? How could I have allowed this to happen? The moments that followed that initial touch seemed to be suspended in time, yet the tension between us grew more palpable with each passing day. I couldn't deny it, no matter how hard I tried. Each glance exchanged with him felt heavier, laden with meaning that I wasn't ready to face. Benjamin no longer looked at me with the innocent gaze of a son, instead, there was something deeper, something unspoken in his eyes, a longing, a curiosity that made me uneasy. I tried to push those thoughts away, to focus on the familiar rhythms of daily life, but they lingered, creeping into the edges of my mind like shadows at dusk. It was as if a door had been opened. And once it was ajar, I couldn't shut it again. With every passing day, I felt more and more like a stranger in my own life, disconnected from the person I thought I was. I was losing my grip. And yet I didn't know how to stop it. Then came that moment, the moment I had been dreading, the moment that changed everything. We stood together under the shower after a long day at the beach. The sound of the water pouring over us like a quiet lullaby. I didn't know why, but I turned to him and asked him to help me wash my back. It wasn't something I had planned to do, but when I said it, it felt as if something inside me shifted, as though I was already too far gone to turn back. His hands were gentle at first, cautious, like he was unsure if he should even be doing this. But then, as I closed my eyes and surrendered to the warmth of the water and his touch, something inside me let go. I could feel his hands on my skin, slowly moving lower, not just helping, but lingering. And in that moment, I should have stopped him. I should have said something, anything. But instead, I let him continue. I didn't stop him. I told myself that it was fine, that he was just helping me. That it was harmless. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The air between us felt thick, charged with a tension neither of us could escape. And then, before I even had a chance to process what was happening, his lips met mine. The kiss was soft at first, almost tentative, but there was something there, something raw, something undeniable. It wasn't just a motherly kiss, it was something far deeper, something that both terrified and exhilarated me. I felt my heart race as I stood there, frozen, unable to pull away. My mind screamed at me to stop, to push him away, but my body betrayed me. I didn't want to stop. The kiss deepened, and I felt his hands move to my back, pulling me closer. For a moment, everything else faded away, the world, the reality of what we were doing, the guilt, it all dissolved into the sensation of his touch, the warmth of his body against mine. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I could only feel. When we finally broke apart, I was left gasping for air, my body trembling with the intensity of what had just occurred. Benjamin stepped back. His eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and desire, his breath heavy. We stood there in silence, the water still rushing over us, but the tension between us was palpable. Like a weight pressing down on both of us. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to feel. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, of shame, of fear, and yet I couldn't deny the strange sense of relief that had washed over me. The air around us was thick with the unspoken truth, we had crossed a line. And that line could never be uncrossed. I should have said something, should have pulled away, should have stopped it right then and there. But instead, I found myself leaning into him, seeking comfort in his arms. As though nothing had changed, as though the world outside didn't exist. His embrace was tight, almost desperate, as if he was holding on to me for dear life. And I realized in that moment that I was holding on to him just as tightly. It was as though we both understood that we couldn't go back to what we were before. But neither of us wanted to face the truth of what we had become. I wanted to pull away. I wanted to scream, to push him out of my life, to put an end to this madness, before it consumed me. But I couldn't. I couldn't let go. The emotions swirling inside me were too intense, too overwhelming. I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to make it right. Benjamin held me, and I let him. It was as if we were both trapped in a moment that neither of us could escape from, a moment that had changed us forever. The air around us was thick with the weight of what we had done. But in that moment, all I could feel was the pull between us, the undeniable connection that had been forged in the quiet intimacy of that kiss. As I stood there in his arms, I realized that I had lost control. I had let myself be swept away by something I didn't fully understand, something that had started as a simple gesture but had turned into something so much more. I didn't know where this would lead, or what the consequences would be. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. I couldn't undo what had happened. I couldn't take it back. And as I looked into Benjamin's eyes, I knew that neither of us could ever go back to the way things were before. We had crossed a line, and now we had to face the consequences. No matter how painful they might be. After the incident, although both of us were aware of the wrongness of the relationship, the sense of fulfillment we found in each other became like a lifeline in the storm of emotions. The feeling of being cared for, being loved, something I had lacked for so long, was now right beside me, making it hard to stop. Thoughts of guilt kept swirling in my mind, but I couldn't overcome the emotional thirst I was experiencing. Benjamin was the same. It seemed like he couldn't escape this ambiguous relationship either. And so, we continued to hide it, living in an unreal world, concealing the things we couldn't speak. However, during a dinner one evening, my daughter accidentally noticed the intimate gesture between me and Benjamin. She innocently asked, "Why do you and Ben look at each other like that?" That question felt like a slap in my mind. My husband, though he didn't say anything, suddenly looked at me with a stern expression. I could feel the panic rising within me because I knew I was on the edge of being discovered. I could feel the tension in the air, as though the entire room was pressing down on me. And every second felt like a threat. Both Benjamin and I realized that we couldn't continue like this anymore. Even though we didn't speak about it. The feeling that everything had spiraled out of control became clearer with each passing day. I didn't know what to do. The guilt kept pushing me to stop. But the fulfillment in this relationship was too strong. I started to realize I was losing control, and in a brief moment, I felt afraid of the consequences that might follow. And then, as a sign of change, Benjamin announced that he would be going to the city to study. Although it was a wise and reasonable decision, for me, it also felt like a release. We both recognized that his going away to study would be the only way for us to break free from this relationship. The only way to stop facing the truth and to escape the tension and inner conflict we were living in. But as Benjamin prepared to leave, I couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. Part of me felt relieved because this ambiguous relationship would finally end, but another part of me felt empty, knowing I would no longer experience that sense of fulfillment. All I was left with was inner conflict, the regret of what had happened. And in that moment, I asked myself, can I truly break free from the shadow of this guilt? Can I start over? 2 years have passed since that day at the beach, and I still live with the consequences of my actions. It's been hard, living with the guilt, the shame, and the fear that someone will find out. The truth is, I don't know what to do now. I don't know if I can ever fix what's been broken. But I share this story now, hoping that someone out there can understand. That someone out there has gone through something similar. Loneliness can lead us down paths we never thought we'd take. It can make us do things we never thought possible. And once you cross that line, there's no going back.
The story ends with a powerful reminder about the complexities of human emotions, loneliness, and the blurred lines that can sometimes be crossed in relationships. It's a reflection on how our deepest struggles can lead us down unexpected paths. What are your thoughts on this? Please leave a comment and share your feelings or opinions about the story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay tuned for the next story that will challenge and make you reflect even more. Remember, this story is fictional and aims to explore the intricacies of human emotions and the consequences of boundary breaking. Please understand that the topics discussed are intense and controversial. And this story should not be seen as an endorsement of harmful behavior. Thank you for being part of this journey.